Some moments change everything. They arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons or casual conversations over dinner. Mine came wrapped in the innocent words of my 8-year-old daughter, delivered with the brutal honesty only children possess. The October wind cut through my jacket as I walked up the familiar stone pathway to David's house in Westchester County. The maple trees lining his driveway had turned that perfect shade of amber that photographers chase, their leaves dancing in the crisp autumn air. 3 years of shared custody had made this journey routine, yet something felt different today. Maybe it was the way Emma had been unusually quiet during our drive from Manhattan, or perhaps it was my own intuition picking up on subtleties I could not yet name. David's colonial-style home stood exactly as it had when we bought it together 12 years ago, back when we believed in forever and Sunday morning pancakes. The white shutters I had insisted on still framed every window, though now they felt like reminders of a woman I used to be. A woman who trusted completely, who never questioned the late nights at the office or the business trips that seemed to multiply with each passing month. Emma bounded ahead of me, her backpack bouncing against her small frame as she ran toward the front door. At 42, I found myself envying her energy, her ability to move between two worlds with the adaptability that only children possess. She had inherited David's dark hair and my stubborn streak, a combination that both terrified and amazed me daily. The door swung open before we reached it, revealing David in his weekend uniform of jeans and a Columbia University sweatshirt. At 45, he still carried himself with the confidence that had first attracted me to him at a medical conference in Chicago 15 years ago. His smile was warm, genuine, the same one that had convinced me to give up my apartment in Brooklyn and move in with him after just 6 months of dating. "Right on time," he said, ruffling Emma's hair as she squeezed past him into the house. His eyes met mine briefly, holding that familiar mixture of affection and awkwardness that had defined our interactions since the divorce papers were signed 2 years ago. The interior of the house remained largely unchanged, though I noticed small differences that marked the passage of time and the absence of my influence. The throw pillows on the living room couch were different, arranged with a precision that suggested someone else's touch. A new painting hung above the fireplace, abstract shapes in blues and greens that I would never have chosen. "Coffee?" David offered, already heading toward the kitchen. "I just made a fresh pot." I followed him through the familiar hallway, past the family photos that somehow still included all 3 of us. Emma had already disappeared upstairs to her room, the one we had decorated together in shades of purple and silver when she was 5. The sound of her footsteps above us provided a comforting rhythm to our stilted conversation. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, evidence of David's weekend baking ritual that he had maintained even after I moved out. A plate of oatmeal cookies sat cooling on the granite countertop, the same recipe his mother had taught me during our second Christmas together. Some habits, it seemed, were harder to break than marriages. "How was your week?" David asked, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He handed me the blue ceramic one I had always preferred, a small gesture that spoke to the intimacy we had once shared. "Busy," I replied, accepting the warmth of the mug against my palms. "The Henderson case is going to trial next month, so the office has been chaotic. As a family law attorney, I spent my days navigating the wreckage of other people's relationships, helping them divide assets and negotiate custody arrangements with the same clinical precision I had eventually applied to my own divorce. The irony was not lost on me that I had become an expert in the legal dissolution of love while remaining mystified by its emotional aftermath." David nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary focus. "Emma mentioned you might be getting a promotion." "Maybe," I said, surprised that Emma had shared this detail. "The partners are expanding the family law division. It would mean more travel, longer hours, but also more security for Emma's future," David added, his voice carrying the weight of shared parental responsibility. We had always been good at this, even during the worst of our marriage. The practical discussions about our daughter's needs, her school performance, her extracurricular activities. It was the emotional landscape that had become treacherous territory, filled with unspoken resentments and carefully managed disappointments. Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs, talking to her stuffed animals in the elaborate games she created. She had always been imaginative, capable of transforming her bedroom into kingdoms and oceans with nothing more than blankets and determination. David and I exchanged a smile, the kind of parental moment that transcended our personal complications. "She wants to try piano lessons," I mentioned, settling into one of the kitchen bar stools. "There's a teacher in our building who comes highly recommended." "That sounds perfect," David agreed. "You know how much she loves music." The conversation flowed with practiced ease, covering the mundane details that comprised our shared responsibility. School forms that needed signing, a birthday party invitation that required coordination, the upcoming parent-teacher conference we would attend together, with the careful choreography of divorced parents determined to maintain normalcy for their child. 20 minutes passed before Emma reappeared, having changed into the clothes she kept at her father's house. She moved between us with the unconscious comfort of a child who had never known her parents to be anything other than separated, having been only 6 when David and I decided we could no longer share the same space without damaging each other further. "Daddy, can we make the brownies today?" Emma asked, climbing onto the stool beside me. "Of course," David replied, already reaching into the pantry for ingredients. "Do you want to help, or do you want to supervise like your mother used to?" The comment was meant to be lighthearted, a reference to my complete inability to bake anything without setting off the smoke detector. But something in his tone caught my attention, a subtle shift that made me look at him more carefully. His movements seemed slightly forced, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Emma chatted about her week as David assembled ingredients on the counter. She told him about the art project she was working on at school, a collage about family traditions that had required her to interview both of us about our childhoods. She had been fascinated to learn that David and I had both grown up in small towns, his in Ohio and mine in Vermont, before finding each other in the complexity of New York City. "Mom told me about the time you got stuck in the elevator on your first date," Emma said, giggling at the familiar story. David glanced at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of something I could not identify. Not embarrassment, but something deeper. Something that made my chest tighten with recognition of a feeling I thought I had processed completely. "That was quite an adventure," he said, his voice carefully neutral. The story had become part of our family mythology. How David had taken me to dinner at a restaurant on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, and how we had been trapped in the elevator for 3 hours when the power went out during a summer storm. How we had talked through the darkness, sharing stories and fears and dreams with the intensity that only emergency situations can create. How he had held my hand when I admitted my claustrophobia, and how I had fallen in love with his calm presence in that confined space. But watching him now, I noticed something I had never seen before. A tension in his shoulders, a reluctance to meet my eyes when Emma brought up that particular memory. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but after 15 years of knowing someone, you develop an instinct for their hidden emotions. Emma continued her chatter, oblivious to the undercurrent of adult complexity flowing around her. She helped David measure flour and cocoa powder, standing on a step stool to reach the mixing bowl properly. Her concentration was complete, her tongue poking out slightly as she leveled each measurement with mathematical precision. "Remember when you and Mom made my birthday cake together?" Emma asked, stirring the batter with determination. David's hand stilled on the vanilla extract bottle. "Which birthday was that, sweetheart?" "My 6th one. The Princess Castle cake. It was right before you stopped living with us." The innocent observation hung in the air like a held breath. Emma continued stirring, unaware of the emotional weight her words carried. David and I exchanged a look across the kitchen island, both of us remembering that particular birthday with perfect clarity. It had been during our final attempt at reconciliation, a 3-month period when David had moved back into our apartment in the Upper West Side. We had convinced ourselves that we could rebuild what had been broken, that love and shared history could overcome the fundamental incompatibilities that had driven us apart. Emma's 6th birthday had fallen right in the middle of that fragile time, and we had thrown ourselves into creating the perfect celebration with the desperate energy of people trying to prove something to themselves. The castle cake had taken us 6 hours to construct, complete with turrets made from ice cream cones and a drawbridge fashioned from graham crackers. We had worked side by side in our tiny kitchen, finding rhythm and cooperation in the shared goal of making our daughter happy. For those 6 hours, it had felt like we might actually succeed in putting our family back together. 2 weeks later, David moved out permanently. "That was a beautiful cake," I said softly, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I said more. Emma beamed at the memory, then returned her attention to the brownie batter. "These are going to be even better because I'm bigger now and I can help more." David resumed his movements, but I could see the effort it required. He had always been good at compartmentalizing emotions, a skill that had served him well as a cardiovascular surgeon, but had sometimes made him seem distant in our marriage. I had learned to read the subtle signs of his internal weather, and right now, storm clouds were gathering. The brownies went into the oven, and Emma announced her intention to show me her latest art project. As we headed upstairs, I caught David's reflection in the hallway mirror. He stood alone in the kitchen, his shoulders sagging slightly, staring at nothing with an expression I had not seen since the day he moved out of our apartment. Emma's room was exactly as I remembered it, a sanctuary of childhood decorated in the purple and silver scheme we had chosen together. Her desk was covered with colored pencils and construction paper, evidence of her artistic ambitions. She pulled out a folder thick with drawings and stories, each one carefully dated and organized with the methodical nature she had inherited from both of us. "This is my family tree project," she announced, spreading a large piece of poster board across her bed. The project was elaborate, with photographs and drawings arranged in careful branches that traced our family history back 3 generations. She had interviewed both sets of grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, and family friends. The result was a comprehensive map of her genetic and emotional inheritance, complete with handwritten stories and carefully glued photographs. "I put you and Daddy at the bottom because you're my parents," Emma explained, pointing to our wedding photo positioned at the base of the tree. "And then I put all the grandparents up here and all the aunts and uncles in the middle." I studied the arrangement, impressed by her organizational skills and touched by the care she had taken with each element. But something caught my attention, a detail that made me look more closely at the photographs she had chosen. "Where did you get this picture of Daddy?" I asked, pointing to a snapshot I had never seen before. Emma looked at the image, a casual photo of David standing in what appeared to be a hospital corridor, wearing his surgical scrubs and smiling at whoever was taking the picture. "Daddy gave it to me last week," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He said it was from when he worked at the big hospital before I was born." I studied the photograph more carefully. David looked younger, maybe in his early 30s, his hair darker and his face less lined. But something about the background seemed familiar, though I could not immediately place why. The corridor behind him had distinctive blue tiles and windows that looked out onto what appeared to be a courtyard with a fountain. "Do you know which hospital this was?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Emma shrugged. "Daddy said it was in Chicago, where he worked before he met you." The explanation made sense. David had completed his residency at Northwestern Memorial before moving to New York to join the cardiac surgery team at Mount Sinai. We had met at a medical conference in Chicago, but by then he was already established in New York. I had never seen many photographs from his Chicago years, something that had never seemed significant until this moment. But looking at the image now, something nagged at me. The architecture, the specific shade of blue on the walls, the way the light fell through those distinctive windows. It reminded me of something, though I could not quite grasp what. Emma launched into explanations of other photographs, stories she had collected from various family members about holidays and celebrations, and ordinary moments that had taken on significance through the alchemy of memory. I listened with half my attention, the other half still fixated on that hospital photograph and the inexplicable feeling that something was not quite right. We spent an hour going through her project, Emma narrating each branch of the family tree with the enthusiasm of a young historian. She had collected stories I had never heard, details about great-grandparents and distant relatives that painted a richer picture of our collective past. Her thoroughness impressed me, but it also highlighted the gaps in my own knowledge about David's history before we met. The timer for the brownies chimed from downstairs, and Emma bounded off the bed with characteristic energy. "Come on, Mom, they're ready!" I followed her down the stairs, still thinking about the photograph and the uncomfortable feeling it had triggered. David was already removing the pan from the oven, the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of chocolate and vanilla. He had cleaned up while we were upstairs, every surface restored to its original order with the precision he applied to everything in his life. "They smell perfect," I said, settling back onto my bar stool. David smiled, but I noticed he avoided looking directly at me. Emma's gotten much better at measuring. These might actually be edible. Emma giggled at his teasing, climbing onto her stool to supervise the cooling process. She chattered about school and friends and weekend plans, her voice providing a comfortable soundtrack to the domestic scene. But underneath the normalcy, I felt a growing tension, like the pressure change that precedes a thunderstorm. The afternoon stretched on with forced pleasantness. We ate warm brownies and discussed Emma's upcoming school play, her role as a tree in the environmental awareness production her third-grade class was preparing. David listened with the focused attention he had always given to our daughter's interests, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement with the natural ease of an engaged parent. But I found myself studying him with new awareness, looking for clues to explain the nagging sensation that something was not quite what it appeared to be. The way he hesitated before answering certain questions, the careful way he chose his words when Emma asked about memories from before she was born, the subtle tension that seemed to underlie his most casual statements. When Emma excused herself to use the bathroom, David and I were left alone in the kitchen for the first time since I had arrived. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken thoughts and careful observations. "She's doing really well with the family tree project," I said finally. David nodded, wiping already clean counters with unnecessary attention. She's always been thorough. That photograph she showed me, the one from Chicago. I don't think I've seen that before. His hand stilled on the dish rag for just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it. I found it in some old files. Thought she might like it for her project. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, but something in his tone made me press further. Which hospital was that? The background looked familiar somehow. David resumed his cleaning, his movements slightly more deliberate than before. Northwestern Memorial. I told you about my time there. He had told me about his residency, but always in general terms. The long hours, the demanding schedule, the steep learning curve of surgical training. But I realize now that I knew very few specific details about those years. Something that had never seemed important when we were building our life together in New York. Emma returned from the bathroom, and the moment passed. But the seed of uneasiness had been planted, and I found myself paying closer attention to details I had previously overlooked. The way David changed the subject when Emma asked about his life before New York. The careful way he edited his stories, keeping them general rather than specific. The photograph that seemed somehow wrong, though I could not articulate why. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself cataloging small inconsistencies, moments of hesitation, subtle shifts in David's demeanor that suggested layers beneath the surface I thought I knew completely. It was like discovering that a familiar room had hidden doors, passages that led to spaces I had never known existed. Emma was gathering her things, preparing for our drive back to Manhattan, when she made the observation that would change everything. "Daddy," she said, zipping up her backpack, "why did you tell Mom you worked in Chicago before you met her?" David froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma looked confused by his reaction, her 8-year-old mind processing information with the literal precision that adults often found disconcerting. "At the hospital in the picture. You told me it was from Chicago, but Grandma Ruth showed me the same hospital when we were looking at old pictures at her house. She said that was where you worked in Boston, where you lived when you were married to Aunt Jennifer." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward with devastating precision. David's face went completely white, his mug clattering against the counter as he set it down with shaking hands. My whole body froze. The room seemed to contract around us, the familiar space suddenly feeling foreign and charged with electricity. Emma looked between her parents with growing confusion, sensing the adult tension she had inadvertently created, but not understanding its source. I decided to hug her, pulling my daughter close as my mind struggled to process what she had just revealed. Over Emma's head, I stared at David, watching him realize that his carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed under the innocent observation of a child who had simply been paying attention. "Emma?" I said carefully, my voice somehow remaining steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "What did Grandma Ruth tell you about Aunt Jennifer?" Emma pulled back from my embrace. Her young face creased with worry as she sensed the gravity of what she had unknowingly unleashed. The kitchen had become a stage where 3 lives were about to be forever altered by the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. "Grandma Ruth said Daddy was married before he met you," Emma said slowly, her voice small in the sudden silence. "She said Aunt Jennifer was really nice and that she was sad when they got divorced because she wanted more grandchildren." Each word landed like a physical blow. I felt my knees weaken as the implications crashed over me like a tsunami. David had been married before. He had never told me. Every story about his past, every explanation about his life before we met, had been carefully constructed fiction. David stood frozen by the kitchen counter, his face cycling through expressions of panic, resignation, and something that might have been relief. The elaborate deception that had sustained our entire relationship was crumbling in real time, and there was nowhere for him to hide. "Emma, sweetie," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, "why don't you go upstairs and get your art supplies? I think you forgot your colored pencils." My daughter looked between us with the intuitive wisdom children possess, understanding that something significant was happening without grasping its full meaning. She nodded silently and climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the house like a countdown. The moment we were alone, David collapsed onto the bar stool across from me, his head falling into his hands. The confident surgeon, the composed ex-husband, the man I thought I had known completely, had disappeared entirely. In his place sat a stranger who had been living a lie for 15 years. "How long?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "How long what? How long were you planning to keep this from me? How long have you been lying about everything?" He flinched at the word lying, but he could not deny its accuracy. The evidence was overwhelming, delivered by our innocent daughter who had simply been collecting family history with the thoroughness we had always encouraged. "I never meant for it to go this far," David said finally. "When we first met, it just seemed easier to simplify things. The divorce from Jennifer had been so messy, so painful. I wanted a fresh start with you." The casual way he said her name, Jennifer, made my stomach lurch. This woman had a name, an identity, a history with my husband that I had never known existed. She had been real, substantial enough to marry, to divorce, to leave an impression on David's mother that lasted years after their relationship ended. "Easier to simplify," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of his words. "You mean easier to lie?" David stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked his backyard, the same backyard where Emma played on weekends, where we had once planned to build a swing set during our brief reconciliation. Everything felt contaminated now, every memory tainted by the knowledge that our foundation had been built on deception. "It started small," David said, his back still turned to me. "When you asked about my past relationships, I told you there had been some dating. Nothing serious. I convinced myself it was true in a way. Jennifer and I were young. It was a mistake from the beginning." "How young?" I demanded. David's shoulders sagged. "We got married when I was 28. The marriage lasted 3 years. I did the math quickly. That meant David had been married to Jennifer until he was 31, just 2 years before we met. Not some distant youthful mistake, but a substantial relationship that had ended recently enough to still be raw, still be complicated." "Why?" I asked, the question encompassing everything. Why lie? Why hide? Why build our entire relationship on a foundation of omission and deception? David turned back to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Shame, yes, but also a desperate vulnerability that made him look younger, more fragile than the composed man I had married. "Because I was terrified of losing you," he said simply. "Jennifer left me because she said I was emotionally unavailable, that I compartmentalized everything instead of dealing with my feelings. She said I was more in love with the idea of being married than with actually being married to her." The words hung between us like an accusation. I thought about our own marriage, the way David had sometimes seemed distant even when he was physically present, the way he approached emotional conversations like medical procedures, methodical and controlled, the way I had sometimes felt like I was married to someone who was performing the role of husband rather than actually being one. "So you decided to prove her wrong by lying to the next woman you met?" I asked. "I decided to be different with you," David corrected. "And I was different. What we had was real, Sarah. Everything between us was real." But even as he said it, I could see the flaw in his logic. How could anything between us be completely real when it was built on such a fundamental deception? Every conversation about our pasts, every discussion about our histories, every moment when I had shared my vulnerabilities while he had carefully edited his own experiences to fit the narrative he wanted to create. Emma's footsteps on the stairs reminded us both that we were not alone in this revelation. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her backpack now properly packed, her young face still marked by confusion and concern. "Are you guys okay?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful, intelligent child who had just inadvertently blown up everything I thought I knew about my life. She had inherited David's analytical mind and my stubborn pursuit of truth, a combination that had led to this moment with the inevitability of a perfect storm. "We're okay, sweetheart," I lied, adding my own deception to the collection that seemed to define our family. "Mommy and Daddy just need to talk about some grown-up things." Emma nodded, accepting the explanation with the trust children give to parents they believe will protect them from adult complexities. But I could see the worry in her eyes, the intuitive understanding that something fundamental had shifted in her world. The drive back to Manhattan passed in a blur of traffic and forced conversation. Emma chattered about her weekend plans, her upcoming school play, her excitement about starting piano lessons. I responded with appropriate enthusiasm while my mind churned through 15 years of marriage, looking for clues I had missed, signs I had ignored, moments when the truth had been hiding just beneath the surface. By the time we reached our apartment on the Upper West Side, I had made a decision. Emma needed stability and normalcy, while I figured out how to process this revelation. Whatever David had done, whatever lies he had told, our daughter should not be collateral damage in the emotional earthquake that was reshaping my understanding of everything. Our apartment felt like a sanctuary after the charged atmosphere of David's house. Emma settled into her homework routine while I stood in our kitchen, staring out at the Hudson River and trying to make sense of what I had learned. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and serene in contrast to the chaos in my mind. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Can we talk tonight after Emma goes to bed?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Come over at 9. The hours until 9 o'clock stretched endlessly. I helped Emma with her math homework, listened to her practice reading, made dinner with the automatic movements of routine, while my thoughts spiraled through implications and questions. How much more had David hidden? What other lies had shaped our relationship? Had Jennifer known about me when David and I started dating? Or had there been overlap, another layer of deception I had not yet uncovered? After Emma was asleep, I sat in our living room and waited. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city below, the constant hum of traffic and life that had always comforted me. Tonight it felt isolating, emphasizing how alone I was with this new knowledge. David arrived exactly at 9, his punctuality a familiar trait that now seemed like another mask, another way of controlling the narrative. He had changed clothes, trading his weekend casual wear for the dark jeans and button-down shirt that made him look more formal, more like the man who had to explain himself. We sat across from each other in the living room where we had once planned our future together, where we had argued and reconciled and made the 1,000 small decisions that comprise a marriage. The space felt different now, charged with the energy of revelations and the weight of unspoken truths. "Tell me about Jennifer," I said, without preamble. David took a deep breath, gathering himself for what he clearly understood would be a comprehensive confession. "We met during my residency at Mass General in Boston. She was a nurse in the cardiac unit." Already another lie exposed. David had told me he did his residency at Northwestern in Chicago, a detail I had never questioned because why would anyone lie about something so mundane? But now I understood that every fabrication had been carefully chosen, each one designed to prevent exactly this kind of discovery. "We got married too quickly," David continued. "I was 28, she was 26. We both thought we knew what we wanted, but we were basically strangers trying to build a life together while I was working 100-hour weeks." I listened without interrupting, letting him construct his narrative while I analyzed every word for additional deceptions. The David sitting across from me now seemed like a completely different person from the man I had married. More uncertain, more human, but also more frightening in his capacity for sustained deception. "The marriage fell apart slowly," David said. "Jennifer wanted more emotional intimacy than I knew how to give. She wanted to talk about feelings and make plans and build something together. But I was so focused on my career, on proving myself as a surgeon, that I treated our relationship like another item on my schedule." The description was painfully familiar. How many times during our own marriage had I felt like David was going through the motions of intimacy without actually engaging emotionally? How many conversations had I tried to initiate about our relationship, our future, our feelings, only to be met with the kind of polite attention he might give to a patient's family member? "She left me after 3 years," David continued. "Said she felt like she was married to a ghost, someone who was physically present but emotionally absent. She was right, but I was too proud and too scared to admit it." "So you decided to reinvent yourself," I said. David nodded slowly. "When I moved to New York, I told myself I was starting over. I would be different, better, more present. And when I met you, I was different. You brought out parts of me that Jennifer never saw, but you never told me about her. At first it seemed unnecessary. We were just dating, getting to know each other. Then as things got more serious, I was afraid that telling you about the failed marriage would make you question whether I was capable of a successful relationship." The logic was twisted but understandable. David had been so afraid of repeating his past mistakes that he had tried to erase them entirely, creating a clean slate that would allow him to become the person he wanted to be. But in doing so, he had made it impossible for us to build genuine intimacy, because intimacy requires complete honesty about who you are and where you come from. "What else?" I asked. David looked confused. "What do you mean? What else have you lied about? If you could fabricate a 3-year marriage and completely change your residency history, what else don't I know?" The question hung between us like a challenge. David's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something that looked like resignation mixed with relief. "There were some financial issues after the divorce," he admitted. "Jennifer and I had bought a house together, and when we split up, I had to buy out her half. It put me in debt for a couple of years." Another lie exposed. David had always told me that he had been fiscally responsible in his 20s, that he had saved money during his residency and fellowship. It was one of the things that had impressed me about him, his financial stability and planning. Now I understood that his careful money management during our early relationship had been born of necessity, not natural prudence. Anything else? I pressed. David was quiet for a long time, clearly debating how much truth he was prepared to reveal. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. My mother never liked Jennifer, but she loved her more than she initially liked you. This revelation hit differently than the others. Ruth had always been polite to me, welcoming in her reserved way, but I had never felt the warmth from her that I had observed in other mother-in-law relationships. I had attributed it to personality differences, to the natural adjustment period that comes with accepting a new person into the family. Now I understood that I had been competing with a ghost, measured against a woman I had never known existed. Ruth thought Jennifer was perfect for me, David continued. When we divorced, she was devastated. She blamed me entirely, said I had thrown away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too stubborn to work on myself. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Ruth's occasional coolness toward me, her tendency to compare my parenting style to unnamed standards, her way of mentioning David's past in vague terms that I could never quite decipher. She had been grieving a daughter-in-law she had lost while trying to accept a replacement she considered inferior. "Does Jennifer know about me? About Emma?" I asked. David shook his head. "We haven't spoken since the divorce was finalized. She moved to California, started over completely. As far as I know, she doesn't know anything about my life after Boston. At least that deception had boundaries. Jennifer was not some secret presence lurking in our lives. Not an ongoing relationship that David had maintained while building a life with me. She was genuinely part of his past, but a past that had been systematically erased rather than honestly integrated." "Why now?" I asked. "Why is Emma just learning about this? Why didn't your mother tell her sooner?" David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from our marriage. "I asked my mother not to mention Jennifer around Emma. I told her it would be confusing for a child to know about a previous marriage that ended before she was born. More lies, more careful management of information. David had been curating our daughter's understanding of family history, just as he had curated my understanding of his personal history. Even Emma, with her innocent questions and natural curiosity, had been receiving a sanitized version of the truth. Ruth must have forgotten, or maybe she thought Emma was old enough to know," David continued. "My mother never agreed with keeping it secret. She thought you deserved to know from the beginning." The irony was sharp. Ruth, whom I had always found somewhat cold and judgmental, had actually been advocating for honesty while her son had been orchestrating an elaborate deception. Every awkward interaction, every moment when I had felt like Ruth was holding something back, had been exactly that. "David," I said, using his name deliberately, formally, "do you understand what you've done?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning, worn down by the weight of maintaining lies for so many years. "I've destroyed your trust," he said simply. "You've destroyed everything," I corrected. "Every conversation we ever had about our pasts, every story you told about your life before we met, every moment when I shared something vulnerable while you edited your own experiences to fit the narrative you wanted me to believe. Our entire relationship has been built on a foundation of lies." David flinched at my words, but he did not try to defend himself. The time for justifications had passed. We had moved into the territory of consequences, and both of us understood that some damage cannot be undone. "I love you," David said quietly. Whatever else was false, that was always true. I studied his face, looking for signs of the man I had married, the father of my child, the person I had planned to grow old with. He was still there, but he was also a stranger, someone capable of sustained deception on a scale I was still trying to comprehend. "I know you do," I replied. "But love without honesty is just performance. And I've been married to a performance for 15 years. The words settled between us with the finality of a door closing. We sat in silence as the implications expanded to fill the room. Our marriage had ended 2 years ago legally, but tonight it was ending emotionally. The final threads of connection severed by the revelation that those connections had never been as real as I had believed. "What happens now?" David asked. I thought about Emma upstairs, sleeping peacefully in her bed, unaware that her family history had been rewritten in the span of a single afternoon. I thought about the custody arrangements we would need to navigate, the conversations we would need to have about honesty and trust, and the importance of telling the truth even when it is difficult. "Now we figure out how to co-parent a child while I decide whether I can ever trust you again," I said. David nodded, accepting the verdict with the same composure he brought to delivering difficult diagnoses to patients. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." I don't know if that's possible, I said honestly. Trust isn't something you can earn back through good behavior. It's something that gets built through consistent honesty over time. And I don't know if I have time to rebuild what you've broken. We talked for another hour, working through practical details and immediate concerns. How to explain the situation to Emma in age-appropriate terms. How to handle future conversations about family history. How to manage the awkwardness of Ruth knowing that her secret had been exposed through an 8-year-old's innocent observations. When David finally left, I sat alone in my living room and tried to process what had happened. In the space of 12 hours, my understanding of my entire adult life had been fundamentally altered. The man I had married, divorced, and continued to co-parent with had been living a carefully constructed fiction, and I had been an unwitting participant in that fiction for 15 years. But alongside the betrayal and anger, I felt something unexpected. Relief, the nagging sense that something had always been slightly off in our relationship, the feeling that David was holding something back, the intuitive knowledge that there were rooms in his life I had never been invited to enter. All of it finally made sense. I had not been imagining the distance. I had not been oversensitive to his emotional unavailability. There had been genuine barriers between us, and now I understood that those barriers had been deliberately constructed to protect secrets he was afraid to share. The next morning, Emma woke up with the same curiosity that had changed everything the day before. "Mom," she said over breakfast, "why did Daddy look so scared when I talked about Aunt Jennifer?" I set down my coffee and looked at my daughter, this beautiful, intelligent child who deserved better than the family mythology that had been constructed around her. She deserved the truth, age-appropriate but honest, about the complexities of adult relationships and the importance of honesty even when it is difficult. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about what to share and what to keep private," I said carefully. "Daddy was married to Jennifer before he met me, and he was worried that knowing about her might be confusing for you." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all new information. "But she's part of our family tree, isn't she? Even if she's not with us anymore?" The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze me. Emma had instinctively understood something that David had been afraid to acknowledge, that our histories, even the complicated parts, are part of who we are. Trying to erase them does not make them disappear. It just makes them more powerful when they inevitably surface. "Yes," I said. "She's part of our family tree. And from now on, we're going to make sure our family tree includes all the real branches, even the ones that might seem complicated." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened as she moved on to other concerns. "Can we still do piano lessons?" "Absolutely," I said, grateful for her resilience and her ability to focus on the future rather than dwelling on adult complications she could not control. Later that day, I called my sister Kate, the only person who had ever expressed reservations about David's seeming perfection. She listened without interruption as I recounted the previous day's revelations, her silence speaking volumes about her own suspicions. "I always thought his stories about his past were too neat," she said finally. "Too edited. Real life is messier than the version he presented." Kate was right. David's carefully curated history had been too clean, too free of the complications and mistakes that define most people's journeys through their 20s and 30s. I had been so impressed by his apparent maturity and stability that I had not questioned why his path to our relationship had been so straightforward. "What are you going to do?" Kate asked. "I honestly don't know," I replied. "Everything I thought I knew about him, about us, has been called into question. How do you rebuild a relationship with someone when you discover they've been fundamentally dishonest about who they are?" "Maybe you don't," Kate said gently. "Maybe this is the universe telling you that the divorce was the right decision for reasons you didn't even know at the time." Her words resonated with uncomfortable truth. Our marriage had ended because of David's emotional unavailability and my growing sense that we were incompatible in fundamental ways. Now I understood that his emotional distance had been carefully maintained to protect secrets he was afraid to share. The marriage might have been saved if he had been honest from the beginning, but it had been doomed by the deception that had shaped it from the start. 3 weeks after Emma's inadvertent revelation, David and I met for coffee to discuss our path forward. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of living without the carefully constructed barriers that had defined his adult life. The confidence that had always marked his presence seemed diminished, replaced by something more human, but also more fragile. "I've been thinking about what you said," David began, "about love without honesty being just performance." I waited for him to continue, no longer willing to make conversations easy for him through prompts or encouragement. "I think I've been performing my whole adult life," he said. "Not just with you, but with everyone. I became so afraid of being rejected for who I really am that I forgot who I really am. The admission was more honest than anything he had shared during our 15 years together. It was also, I realized, too late. The time for this kind of self-awareness had been before we got married, before we had a child together, before I had invested decades of my life in a relationship with someone who was fundamentally unknown to me. I appreciate your willingness to be honest now, I said carefully, but I need you to understand that this isn't something we can just work through. You didn't just lie about your past. You denied me the opportunity to make informed decisions about our relationship based on complete information. David nodded, his eyes reflecting acceptance of consequences he was finally beginning to understand. Jennifer left you because you were emotionally unavailable, I continued. But you were emotionally unavailable with me, too, just in a different way. Instead of being distant, you created a false persona that seemed intimate, but was actually just another wall. The parallel between his two marriages was becoming clear to both of us. David had not actually changed between relationships. He had just found a more sophisticated way to maintain emotional distance. Instead of withdrawing, he had performed intimacy while keeping his real self carefully hidden. I want to be different, David said. For Emma, for any future relationships, for myself. I want to learn how to be honest about who I am, even when it's uncomfortable. That's good, I replied. Emma deserves a father who models honesty and emotional courage. But David, you need to understand that this work is something you do for yourself, not as a way to win me back. He looked at me with an expression that might have been relief mixed with sadness. You're not going to give us another chance. I'm not going to give us another chance, I confirmed. But I'm going to work on forgiving you. Because Emma needs parents who can co-parent effectively, and because holding on to anger would only poison my own life. We spent the next hour working out practical details for moving forward. How to handle Emma's questions about family history. How to manage holidays and special events. How to rebuild a functional co-parenting relationship on a foundation of honesty, rather than the carefully managed politeness that had defined our post-divorce interactions. When we parted that day, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Clarity. The confusion and doubt that had marked the final years of our marriage finally made sense. The feeling that I was missing important pieces of who David really was had been accurate. The sense that our intimacy was somehow incomplete had been justified. For the first time since our divorce, I felt confident that ending our marriage had been the right decision. Not because David was a bad person, but because our relationship had been built on a foundation too unstable to support the weight of genuine partnership. 6 months later, Emma and I were thriving in our life together. She had started piano lessons and discovered a natural talent that brought joy to our small apartment. Her family tree project had evolved into a broader interest in genealogy, and she had begun asking thoughtful questions about family history that I answered with complete honesty, even when the answers were complicated. David had begun therapy and was making genuine progress in understanding the patterns of behavior that had led to his elaborate deceptions. He remained a devoted father, but his relationship with Emma was now built on honesty, rather than the carefully managed image he had previously maintained. Ruth had apologized to me for keeping David's secret, explaining that she had disagreed with his decision from the beginning, but had respected his wishes out of misguided loyalty. We had begun building a new relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Emma's well-being. And I had begun dating again, cautiously but with new confidence in my ability to recognize authenticity. The experience with David had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt off, to ask direct questions about inconsistencies, and to value emotional honesty above all other qualities in a potential partner. Emma's innocent question about a photograph had changed everything, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be exposed. Sometimes children see clearly what adults work hard to obscure, and sometimes the most devastating revelations are also the most necessary. The truth, as painful as it had been to discover, had finally set us all free.